The goal of today's lecture is to help you understand how the United States became a world leader in natural resources. I'm talking cotton, wheat, minerals, industrial minerals. Like, the United States was really the foremost supplier of all of these things, and we want to understand the role that innovation played in bringing the United States up to this leader status. So we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about cotton, we're going to talk about wheat, and we're going to talk about industrial minerals. First, let's get into cotton. The United States quickly became a leader in world cotton production, and there really was no industrial way, mechanization for you to get up there. What I mean by that is you couldn't get tractors, you couldn't get anything that would come through and mechanize this. It was all done by hand at first, and yet we went from producing essentially no cotton to being the leader of cotton production. How did that happen? Something really interesting about the story of rising cotton productivity is to see how productivity was rising. Look at this graph right here. You can see from 1800 through 1860, productivity was rising. It started to taper off over time. There's a lot of variation. Each of these dots is variation in productivity, but you can see a clear rise in productivity. And this is productivity per worker. This means how much each worker is able to pick per day. And so we're seeing this huge rise in productivity. The question is, what is behind this rise in productivity? Now, one of the first hypotheses that should come to your mind is slavery. You should be thinking, oh, slavery is driving this, because of course cotton was just linked to slavery, right? Like, that is where most American slaves were being used, was in the cotton industry. So was it slavery that drove American cotton productivity? No, it was not slavery. We know this for a couple of reasons, but let's first talk about why people thought it was slavery that drove cotton productivity. And when I say people, I mean people today. There are a lot of people today who think that slavery was the main driver of cotton productivity. That is not the case. The reason why they think it is because they have this kind of like coercive labor hypothesis. The idea is, you can just get people to be incredibly productive if you just whip them. If you beat them, they're going to respond to that, and they're going to produce, and they're going to pick, they're going to go out there and work. And they go even further. The proponents of this hypothesis go even further and say, hey, well, we set goals. You get the slaves to meet that goal, and then you increase that goal, and you beat them if you don't get there, and you just keep ratcheting it up to try and get them to produce more and more. And we would call this the coercion hypothesis, that you can just get slaves to work harder and harder, and that's what leads productivity to be higher and higher. Of course, slave owners were using coercion. They were beating their slaves and using that to motivate work. But the rise in productivity is just way too large for it to be solely coercion that's driving it. Another reason why we know it's not slavery is because if it was slavery driving this productivity, then you would imagine when slavery disappears, we would suddenly see a drop in cotton production in the United States. And if you look at just a time series of cotton production over time, like this graph, you'll see you can't even tell when the Civil War happened. We have observations right before and right after, and they just look like they're on this nice arc. No effect from slavery disappearing. And in fact, there really wasn't an effect. I'm going to show you some data that shows when slavery went away, you still had pretty productive cotton production. So if it's not attributed to slavery, what was driving U.S. cotton productivity? The answer is biological innovations. It was getting better and better at cultivating the highest producing cotton seeds or cotton varieties. I'm going to use varieties a lot here. Variety is a reference to the type of seed that you're using. Some varieties have high output and other varieties have low output. And so you get more efficient varieties. You're getting seeds that produce more cotton per seed. One of the really interesting things at this time is how farmers are experimenting with different varieties of cottonseed and trying to figure out which ones work the best. One of my favorite is from this article called The Rotten Cotton, which is just a beautiful headline for an article like this. It just rolls off the tongue, The Rotten Cotton. This article describes a man who was experimenting with cotton, and he reports, "The last year I purchased in Augusta a bag containing about 6 bushels of what is termed Petite Gulf cottonseed, and with it planted about 10 acres of land. This cotton did not suffer from rot, whilst a fourth, at least, of the balance of my other cotton crop was lost by it. So he's running 2 cotton crops at the same time, one on a small 10-acre experiment and the other is his main crop. His main crop loses about 25% of its output due to rot, due to just fungus, pests that come through. It goes away. The other one, no loss from rot. With the seed produced from these 10 acres of cotton, I planted 70 acres the present year and had enough left to replant a supply if occasion should have required it. So he's saying that the output from these 10 acres was so good that he could get another 70 acres out of it and have enough left over in case he needed to replant or take care of things. What's interesting here is you have farmers experimenting, trying to figure out the best forms of cotton for their land, and then they're sharing these results with others, saying, hey, I tried this is what I found, I think this might be a good path for other people to try too. So how do we know that it was the seed? How do we know that it was finding better seeds that led to increased cotton productivity? Well, 2 economists, Alan Olmsted and Paul Rohde, went through and found records of these plantation owners going through and just really documenting how they use their seed, which seeds they used that year, what their output was, and we can just track over these records what seed they're using, and we can use just really natural experiments, almost natural experiments. I don't want to be too liberal with that word, but let's imagine you have the same plantation run by the same people. So you can hold constant the people who are running that plantation. You know that there's not a change in management. It's not like we brought in a new person and all of a sudden they know how to do things better than the old people. We're going to have the same people managing it. And let's look at what their product was before the Civil War. So they still have slaves. And they're using the old cotton seed. Okay, this is before they find new cotton seed. They have slaves. Their output is 44 pounds per worker, and those workers are slaves. From the records, we know that they then introduce a new variety of seed. They get a high yielding variety that gives them more cotton per bull, and they still have slaves. Okay, so we're looking at new seed, now slaves, right? We're looking at this really nice thing where we're just gonna change one thing at a time. First, old seed, slaves. Now we're looking at new seed, slaves. And with the new seed and slaves, they were able to pick 147 pounds per worker. After the Civil War, on the same plantation, we have records. So this is a point where we have seed and we have free labor. We don't have slaves anymore. You see how we've changed one thing at a time? We changed the seed first, and now we're changing the labor. So what happens with free labor and the new seed? They're able to pick 157 pounds per worker. So the biggest increase in productivity comes from switching the seed. And you even get a little bit of an increase in productivity from switching the type of worker. You might have more productive workers under free labor than you do slave labor. I'm not going that far to say this, but you get such a huge increase in productivity just by looking at changing the seed that it's clearly the seed that's driving the productivity gains. So that's the main lesson I want you to take away from this little cotton portion, is that the huge increase in American productivity in cotton comes from them experimenting with seeds and getting better and better biological innovations that drive this forward. Now let's go on to wheat. How did the US become such a big wheat producer? Now, while the US was a big wheat producer, it looked like the US wasn't actually having any innovation or progress in wheat production. This is wheat productivity over time. What we're looking at is the number of bushels per acre harvested. So this is a measure of productivity, and what we see is that it is flat from 1860 up to the early 1900s. Productivity is not changing, and then we have mechanization. So we're getting better tractors, we're getting better equipment to go out there, and we see this little takeoff in productivity. Now there's an interesting puzzle behind this flat line. It looks like productivity is flat, but we're also changing where we're producing wheat. We used to produce it in New England, kind of the Midwest. We're looking at Ohio, and now we're expanding out west and planting more wheat out west. In fact, John Clippart, who was the 1860 expert in wheat, proposed that you could never move wheat production out west. In his view, the commercial wheat belt would be forever limited to Ohio, Pennsylvania, and western New York. The soils and climate of Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin would doom those states to the haphazard production of low quality and low yielding spring wheat. Further west, the climate and soils made any wheat production unlikely. The entire territory south of southern Indiana and southern Illinois could never yield reliable crops because of rust. Heading out to the west was so different from the east. It was basically like going to another continent. You cannot take the seeds that you were growing in the east and just expect them to grow in the west. The climates are not compatible. You are going to fail. Here's a nice example. If you were to look at Wooster, Ohio, which was in the wheat belt, and compare it to new places where people were going, like Dickinson, North Dakota, and Fort Hays, Kansas, you're gonna see that the climate is completely different. The driest year in Wooster, Ohio was wetter than the average years in North Dakota and Kansas. And also the coldest year in Wooster was warmer than the average year in North Dakota. Furthermore, there was this challenge of rust, which was mentioned at the end of that quote, where it says you couldn't go further out because of rust. Rust was a fungus that would attack wheat. It's called rust because it has this reddish tint to it. It was carried on the wind and it would attack the wheat and it would destroy the wheat before you could harvest it. So there were only two ways that you could fight this. You either had to have a biological resistance in your wheat to the rust, where the rust couldn't eat away at it as quickly, or your wheat had to mature quick enough that you could harvest this before the rust came, because the rust came at a certain time of season. So if you knew when rust was coming and you could get your wheat to mature before then, you could go through and harvest before the rust was even coming through the area. So there were tons of challenges to moving out west. People thought it was impossible. There was no way for you to get out there and farm wheat. And yet, the center of wheat production moved from that Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio area out west. It moved to North and South Dakota, to Kansas, to all these areas out west where they said it was impossible to farm wheat. What happened? Well, this is another example of biological innovation. Same exact thing as what was happening in cotton. People were constantly experimenting, trying to find the type of wheat that could grow in these different areas. They were crossbreeding wheats. They found wheats that would mature early and avoid the rust, and then they tried to find and crossbreed that with something that was high yielding, so that way they could get more and more wheat in those areas. And what amazes me of all of this is that there's this there isn't a sophisticated understanding of genetics at this point. It's just pure backwards farmers. Backwards is kind of like not the right word I want to use for it, but it's just like guys that are yucking around trying to figure out the best thing for their plot. It's constant experimentation and innovation, the type of thing where you're just tinkering with it. I love this because we're seeing that a lot of innovation just comes from tinkering and iterating until you're able to get to something that works. It also tells us something about what's going on behind this data. Remember, wheat productivity is flat during this time, but they're moving out to places where they should have had worse and worse productivity because of how hard it was to farm wheat in those areas. Yet, they're able to experiment and innovate to get up to a high productivity output. They're able to match what they're doing in the East. This is quite frankly amazing. This is a lesson in innovation. I love this lesson because it's just so cool. Sorry if I'm geeking out about this, but just think about how something so simple as trying to grow wheat out west shows us the American innovative spirit. Get on that train. Speaking of which, let's jump forward in time. Let's not be back in the 1800s, early 1900s. Let's get to the mid-1900s, late 1900s, and talk about Norman Borlaug, who is an American hero that most people don't even know his name. Norman Borlaug is an agriculturalist who was trying to figure out how to make higher yielding wheat. That is, how do you make wheat that is more productive, where each stalk produces more and more wheat. Now the problem with this is wheat is top heavy. If you've seen those amber waves of grain, you get all that grain right up at the top. If you try to produce more of it, that's gonna collapse the stalk. It's gonna fall over, and if it collapses, it's going to die, and you actually get nothing, right? So how can you get more wheat if the plant just naturally collapses when you try to produce more? Well, here's how he did it. He combined high-yielding wheat with a dwarf stalk, a shorter stalk that had a thicker stem that could support this. Amazing innovation. Let's take, the problem is if we get too much up at the top, it falls over. So let's bring it down. Let's bring down the center of mass. Let's put it on a thicker stalk that can support it. And now we get double, triple the amount of wheat per stock. Huge increase in agricultural productivity. Now, a lot of his work started in Mexico, and in just 20 years of experimentation and getting this out, Mexico went from being a net importer of wheat, that is, they could not produce enough to support their people, where they had to actually buy it from other countries and import it, to becoming a net exporter, where they had so much wheat that they had to sell it to other countries because they couldn't consume it all themselves. And then what's even more amazing was what happens in India. Now, India in the 1960s looked like it was headed for disaster. Paul Ehrlich, in his book The Population Bomb, said the battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. So Paul Ehrlich, right at this time, is saying, our population is growing too fast. This is the Malthusian economy. This is Thanos coming in. We need to get rid of the population. And India looked like the picture-perfect case of this negative argument. In 1965, India was only producing 12.3 million tons of wheat. Not enough to feed their population. Well, Borlaug goes over there. Borlaug takes what he learned in Mexico and he goes over to India and he does the same thing. He figures out the type of wheat that can grow there, that can have high yielding wheat on dwarf stalks and actually survive. By 1974, just a few years later, India is self-sufficient in producing wheat. And in the year 2000, it produced 76 million tons of wheat. Huge jumps in agricultural productivity just by learning how to tweak the type of wheat we grow, right? Like, this is amazing. This saved millions of lives. Norman Borlaug saved millions of lives just by experimenting and learning what kind of wheat would grow high-yielding varieties without collapsing on itself. Norman Borlaug is amazing. I think more people should know who he is. So far, we've talked about cotton productivity and wheat productivity, and the answer to how the US became more productive in both of those is biological innovation. Now we're gonna move on to industrial minerals. How did the United States become so productive in industrial minerals? During the second half of the 19th century and during the early 20th century, the United States was becoming a world leader in industrial minerals. And at the same time, it's becoming a world leader in industrial minerals. In fact, it is the #1 supplier of most of the important industrial minerals, such as coal, iron ore, copper, lead, zinc, silver, tungsten, molybdenum, I don't know how to pronounce that one, petroleum, arsenic, phosphate, antimony, magnesite, mercury, and salt. The United States was just leading the supply of these industrial minerals. And so obviously there's a connection, right? Like, you have industrial minerals right there, makes it much easier for you to industrialize, but also you get to ship them out to other countries and get the funds to support economic growth in the United States. This is a win-win situation for them, except for the fact of depleting natural resources. But the question is that, do we need to rely on those resources forever? I don't know. We'll figure that out along the way. But the common view at this time was that the United States just was this land of plenty. George Otis Smith, who was a U.S. geological surveyor, said that the United States is more richly endowed with mineral wealth than any other country. We just have more of this stuff than everybody else. That's why we're able to be the world leader. And if that's the case, it kind of looks unfair, right? Like, oh, well, you guys just ended up with this great set of factor endowments. No wonder you're able to go through and do these kind of things. No other country was able to compete with that. But the thing is, we actually were not the world leader in industrial minerals. Turned out, you know, we had some in abundance, but it's not like we were the only source of industrial minerals in the world. This big table has a lot of information in it. Let me try to break it down really simply. In the left-hand column for each country, you're gonna see the percent of 1913 output that country supplied. So if it's 50%, that means 50% of the world supply came from that country. On the right is going to be how much of that mineral that country actually had in the entire world supply, right? How much it had in its country. Now that we can look with hindsight and actually evaluate these kind of things. So here's the thing. So if your left-hand column is 50%, that means that you supplied 50% of the world's, let's say, gold. And if the right-hand column is 50%, that means you also had 50% of the world's gold in your country. Okay, so there's one is it in your country, and the other one is how much are you actually using and putting out there. Now, if those two are the same, 50%, 50%, that means you're doing exactly what we'd expect. If you have 50% of the world's gold, we would expect you to use 50% of it. If you are using 50%, but you only have 25%, you're punching above your weight right there, right? Like, you're using more, you're producing more than what you actually have relative to the rest of the world. Conversely, if you're at 50% and you have 80% of the world's gold, that means that even though you have most of the world's gold, you're only producing half of it. There are other countries punching above their weight. If we look across all these different minerals, we'll see that the US is punching above its weight. If the left-hand column is greater than the right-hand column, the US is punching above its weight. We see for lots of these, like bauxite, which was important for creating aluminum, the US has hardly any of the world's supply. They only have 0.5% of the world's supply of bauxite, and yet they are supplying the world with 37% of its bauxite. Whereas the converse is the case over in Latin America. Latin America has 29% of the world's reserves of bauxite, and yet it was producing none. It just wasn't tapping into its resources. Another example is iron ore. The US was producing 36% of the output in iron ore and only had about 12% of the world's reserves, whereas the USSR, Soviet Union, they have 36% of the world's reserves and are only producing about 6% of the output there. So the USSR is punching way below its weight back in 1913, and the United States is punching way above its weight. So the question is, why is the US able to consistently punch above its weight and other countries are far behind? Well, one reason might be westward expansion, right? We talked about this with wheat. Maybe you're getting out to these western areas, you're discovering new places, you're discovering new reserves, and you're like, hey, let's put these into production. And that's plausible. There's some of that happening there, but a lot of what was happening was in places where the US had already explored. We're seeing things like copper going in Michigan, we're seeing coal in Pennsylvania and Illinois, we're seeing oil in Pennsylvania and Indiana. We're seeing these resources being found in places where the United States already settled. So it can't be just that we're expanding out west and finding new resources. Well, could it be that we were just much bigger? The United States is a relatively big territory. Maybe we just have more stuff because we're bigger, but that doesn't quite make sense because the area that would have composed the USSR was really big. And so they also had a lot of the resources. They could have been exploiting that. The entire area of the United Kingdom covered a lot of land area. They could be exploiting it. So it's not that we were a bigger country. Why is it that we were able to exploit these things much better than any other country at the time? There are two keys. First is the role of mining laws. The United States has a unique set of mining laws where all of these resources, the minerals, the oil, anything, belongs to whoever owns that land. This is unique because in countries like the United Kingdom, all of those things, anything below the surface, belongs to the sovereign. It belongs to the king. That means if you were digging in your backyard and suddenly you find an oil reserve or you find gold, none of that actually belongs to you. Even if you own the property, even if it's your backyard and you're in England, that does not belong to you. That belongs to the king. So you cannot use that to sell and get rich off of the minerals that are on your property. That goes to the king and they get to decide how those resources are used. The United States, totally different. You get to keep whatever is underneath your property. So if you strike oil, suddenly you can hold on to that and start developing pumps, and you can start refining oil, whatever. You can start developing that resource. You can sell the land, and now that we know there's oil on it, you can get a big price on that. It gives you an incentive to develop those resources, and more than just an incentive to develop, it gives you an incentive to find them. Now if I go out and I look for these resources and I find something, I get to keep all of that value. So these mining laws are unique and they provide incentives to develop and discover new sources. And the second reason is something called the ethos of exploration. The United States really just had this idea that we needed to get out there and explore the resources we had. More than any other country, we sent out people to just survey the geography and say, what do we have out there? Where are these resources located? We commissioned tons of surveys. We actually started developing some of the best mining education in the world. Our education was so good that we actually started sending engineers around the world to help them develop their resources. And generally, we just had this optimism about finding new sources. We just said, hey, why can't we find this? Think about the gold rush out in California. People moving out there saying, of course I can find gold out there. Sure, everybody else is going out there, but I'm gonna be the guy that gets out there and finds gold before everyone else does. And so there's this general optimism that you would actually find things when you went out and looked for them. So all this is really hard for an economist. Like mining laws, that makes tons of sense for an economist. This gets to more of a little bit of culture, which is a little bit of weird for an economist to say, but we had this ethos of exploration where we just went out there and got things done. And hopefully you get a little bit of that from this entire lecture. People just trying to learn and discover new things and develop and grow. Man, it's so cool. We're gonna keep talking about innovation when we talk in the next lecture about patents and how they help encourage innovation.